So good afternoon. My name is Brian Donnelly, and you're here for a session on design thinking. The first thing I'm going to ask you to do, I have 5 different colors of little Post-it notes. I'm just going to pass these around. Pick a color that's different than somebody near you so that we've got kind of a mix of them. Or actually, let me change my thinking here. This group here, just each of you grab a green. Why don't we just get clusters and then they... You look orange. Some folks there. Pink. You'll have to come up and join the... So everybody should have one of these little Post-it notes. So while we get those set up, let me give you a little bit of my own background to kind of give you a sense of what I'm going to be presenting. My background is in industrial design. I went to Rhode Island School of Design for my master's. I wound up teaching at UCLA and San Francisco State University in the design program. And about 9 years ago, when my children were about 5 or 6, I wound up taking a job in a middle school. And 10 years ago, if somebody told me I'd be teaching middle school, I would have told them you're out of your mind. But I've actually been very thankful for that opportunity because it gives you a chance to really understand the adolescent mind or the developing adolescent mind, which has helped me in terms of my work with Autodesk with respect to developing curriculum. I'm a real advocate for educational reform, and part of this presentation, I hope I can make the point that I think we have to do more than reform. I think we have to reinvent or reimagine what education needs to be. So you all have a colored Post-it note. And I know you've probably just eaten lunch and you want to kind of sit. But we're going to do something that hopefully will tie into my presentation. So let's get all the people in green. Come over here. If you're in orange, you can kind of congregate here. The other colors, let's just kind of find some spaces in these open areas. So if you've got, what's the other color? Pink. Let's do pink, like over in here. Green, let's kind of do sort of back in that area. Yellow, you're in the middle here. Any other colors left over? What's the other color? White? Okay, let's get white up in here. All right, here's what... do we have those balls? Here's what you're going to do. So each team, how many teams we got? 1, 2, 3, 5, right? Okay, so we'll do 4 each. You're going to get 4 of these little spheres. Okay? Why don't you go ahead and hand those out? What's that thing? Did we bring the paper? We didn't bring the paper. We didn't bring paper. Is that pad here? Okay. And I apologize, we're missing one of our props. Where's that pad of paper? Yeah. Oh, we didn't bring it? Shoot, we don't have any paper. Is that paper? All right, we'll deal with that. Just give each group a paper. Okay, you're going to get a sheet of paper. You've got 2 balls. You've got 2 minutes to figure out a game, or as many games as you could imagine that a kid could play with a sheet of paper and a couple of spheres, and a game wouldn't be anything without a wine glass, so you'll get like 3 wine glasses. Make up a game. You're 5 years old. You're playing. Work together. You got 4. Let's pass out those things. Just hand them all out. Yeah.
You have the wine glass.
Oh, James, do you have more of the balls? They don't have any. They don't have any spheres. How many balls did you have? 2? 4? Or we need to steal one from you? We need to steal 2. Hand over your sphere.
Really limits it.
Okay, but you also should, anything that you have on you, you can use. Okay, like your badges. You can use anything that you have on you, like your badges or a piece of paper. Hand them out some paper. You need... You got... You need a few of these?
Yeah, just them out.
Oops. We don't have anything to draw on. So. No, you don't need pens. Unless you want to write something on there with pen. Hi. Good.
Brent Dunn.
Brent, nice to meet you.
Worked with you a little bit on some
Right.
cognitive stuff.
Yeah.
Kids and that.
Yeah.
How are you? What are we doing here?
A little activity. Okay, so we could probably do this for a while, but we're just going to real quickly. Here's group number, not number, color. What color are you?
Pink.
Pink, okay. Could you tell us what your game's about? Everybody kind of just listen into this.
I have no idea.
Okay, he doesn't know what it is. Head game designer, what is this game?
Well, we thought we were trying to see how many games we could come up with. We have 9 so far.
9 games so far. What's your favorite game?
I think catching with the cups.
Catching with the cup. So you hold the cup and catch the sphere. Team, what color? Team Orange. Anybody a spokesperson for Team Orange?
I didn't come up with these ideas, though.
Okay.
We came up with wine pong.
Was it?
Wine pong.
Wine pong.
Like beer pong, but set
Okay.
with wine.
All right.
And then just stacking them.
Stacking them. Okay. How about group color? Green. How many games?
Well, our favorite one, we didn't know we were supposed to write on this, so we made a blowgun out of this and blew it into the cup.
So you're having too much fun back there, but they use the paper as a blowgun so that you could blow the spheres. Very good. And last group over there who's having fun. What are you doing? Okay, so we've got pool here. And how many games did you come up with? Snooker.
Don't have enough bowls.
Oh, okay. Did you come up with any others? 16 games. Okay, so go back to your seats. No more playing. Aww. Let's go to the slide with... just go to the slide with Ed Harris. The slide with Ed Harris. Just go forward. Keep going. No. Does anybody know what movie this is from? Okay, and what does he say? Could you hit the next slide? Okay, failure is not an option. Could you go to the next? So what is failure? When you think of failure, what is failure? What comes to mind when you think of the word failure? Anybody? You're all failures. Okay? How does it make you feel? Your game was the stupidest game in this room. Deal with it. Someday you will learn when you're an adult. How does it make you feel when you're in a system that all you're working against is, can I not fail? Think about our educational system and what are kids doing? Now, I have a bias here because I am from the States, and that's only one educational system, so I can only really speak to that, both as somebody who's been in the classroom and somebody who's done a lot of research in this area. One of the things that I've, the past 4 years, been involved in a research study on a school in San Diego called High Tech High, which you may have seen in some of the books on educational reform. High Tech High is a part of a charter management organization, very much emphasizing project-based learning, very much emphasizing design thinking as a way of approaching education. If we go to the next one. Oops, failure is not an option. Okay. Do you all know who he is? What show is he on? Mythbusters. Is he Jamie or I forget which name he is? Okay. Failure is always an option. So think of a school. What are kids constantly doing? They have a textbook, they have a teacher, they have content that they have to master, and what do? On a test, they give that back to the teacher. Their success is marked based on that ability to give that back. Yet if you read about innovative companies, one of the biggest in the nation who really helped push this notion of design thinking is a company called IDEO. And their motto is, fail early, fail often. Can any of you give me your take on the importance of failure? Did any of you go to the summit meeting this morning, the last speaker? What was she talking about in terms of the importance of failure? She used a term called fail up, which I hadn't heard before. I love it. Failing up. Learning by trying things, learning by making mistakes, and then reflecting on what it is that you did and how you might change it. That's very different than the approach that we have taken for the most part in at least U.S. education. There's a book that came out last year by a woman named Diane Ravitch. It's called The Death and Life. I found it interesting. She had The Death and Life of the American School System. Have any of you seen it or read it? So Diane Ravitch, the author, is from Columbia University, and she's a historian who's focused on education. And she was one of the main architects under the Bush administration for No Child Left Behind. How many of you are familiar with No Child Left Behind? How many? A lot of you? Okay. I've heard people call it No Child Left Untested. So she was one of the primary authors of No Child Left Behind. And in this book, The Death and Life of American Education, she basically spends 400 pages apologizing that she totally got it wrong. That the focus, absolute focus on testing accountability has not served students well in terms of preparing them for these 21st century jobs, a global economy, all kinds of terms that people use, but certainly an approach to education where kids are penalized for failure. There's no time in the class to try something and make a mistake and get back to it. Because what is the teacher and the school under pressure for? To get those scores up. If it can't be placed on that standardized test, then it's not worth spending time on. And that's the message that I would often get from math and science teachers. In research, I would ask them, what could you do to engage your students? Now, preface this by saying there's, in the United States, a huge problem in terms of the achievement gap. The numbers in terms of students dropping out of school are staggering. There's a movie series called 1098 on entrepreneurship that I'd highly recommend you might want to look at, but it follows 8 different students who participate in this entrepreneurship program. They're from different parts of the United States. And when each of them are introduced, for example, a young man from New York City, and they came up with some text on the slide and said 49% African American students in New York City drop out by the time they should be in 12th grade. And the Gates Foundation has done a major study, and it's called the Silent Epidemic, that talks about the dropout problem. And no surprise that the feedback that they received from students who were interviewed, they said, if I had something that was relevant, that I had something that engaged me, I would not have dropped out. If we can go to the next slide. So, the big mantra right now in the United States is STEM. We've got to be competitive internationally because it's a flat world, as Tom Friedman says. And if you go to the next one, if you go to any education conference, you'll often see these statistics about the United States in terms of where they score in math, where they score in science, and it's far down below in relationship to other countries. The fact that we are in that position doesn't concern me as much as even if we were to rise to that top, we're still not getting to those sorts of skills that kids really need. Let's go to the next one. So this is the school, High Tech High in San Diego. About 5 years ago, I was asked to participate on a study. We've interviewed over 100 students, administrators, teachers. And in talking to the CEO of the school, there's 9 charters, they have a CEO, and he was talking about an experience he had. He had 2 college presidents visiting the school, trying to find out, what's this thing that they're doing that's so great, et cetera, et cetera. And so he showed them around, and he had them in his room, he was talking to them. And as they were leaving, these 2 students were working on this RC helicopter that they were building, and it wasn't working. And these 2 men with suits who looked very professional and important came over, and the kids basically said, "Don't bother us, we're trying to figure out this problem." And the context for the CEO telling me this story is that the best thing that could have happened on this tour was that this thing at that moment in time wasn't working, because it gave those visitors a chance to see the importance of failure, that at the moment it was failing, it wasn't working. But then they had a chance to kind of play around with it, and actually while they were there, the kids later on in the day figured out how to make this thing operate. Another interesting thing about that school, if you can see all the glass there, it's very transparent. One of the things that you'll see often in education, it's very privatized. The teacher goes into their little room, and that world exists as a little silo. And if I teach math, then The kid goes from my room to the science classroom. Rarely is there a connection. The student goes from science to English. Rarely is there a connection, and so on and so forth. So the school, in many ways, even though it's called high-tech high, perhaps one of the more high-tech aspects of it is this culture of being very permeable, being very open, for people to see the mess, to see the thinking, to see the failure. So design thinking is very much about being open to failure, being open to working with others, and through different iterations, try to come up with a solution. There's a book out called Creating Innovators by Tony Wagner. Any of you familiar with it? Highly recommend it. He did a fantastic TEDx presentation about 3 or 4 months ago, and it was kind of a synopsis of his book. But one of the points that he makes, and this fits into this notion of design thinking, that knowledge today, he believes, and I agree with him, is a commodity. He'll ask, how many people in a room can recite the capitals of every 50 states in the United States? And we'll have a race. You recite it while I go on Google and look it up. Or if you go to a site like the Khan Academy, and if you want to learn the basics of calculus or trig or whatever topic, there's so much out there in terms of accessing knowledge. So one of the things that I found real interesting, about 3 years ago, if any of you remember, there was a movie called Waiting for Superman. Waiting for Superman was this kind of critique of American education. One of the things that I found kind of disturbing is they had a little cartoon that supposedly represent a really great teacher. And in this little cartoon, the teacher walks behind the student, opens up their head, and pours in knowledge. That, in my opinion, is not a great teacher. What the last speaker in the summit talked about, of having somebody who has the ability to create these learning experiences, to facilitate these learning experiences, as opposed to just filling a student with content, because content is so freely available. Knowledge as a commodity is out there. Wagner says, it's not so much what you know, the real important thing is what you do with what you know. And design thinking, which is a mindset that embraces what is called iteration, trying things, making mistakes, allows you to take what you know and do something with it, to apply it to a different context. There's a lot of research in terms of how people learn, where the focus is the learner taking control of their own understanding. Being able to apply what they know to a different context. For example, a student in history studying about the Civil War, being able to take that understanding and apply it to what has happened in a place like Rwanda. So taking this one understanding and applying it to somewhere else. Or taking your understanding of physics and applying it to some problem that has to utilize that knowledge, as opposed to just studying some formula that's often typical in a book. So go to the next one. By the way, that was the Khan Academy, that last image. So Wagner, in creating innovators, he also wrote a book called The Global Achievement Gap. And in fact, he provides a long description of the school high-tech high, among several other schools where he feels like they're really using design thinking and using these skills. So if you go ahead. So he describes what he called the skills for success in the global knowledge economy. he had interviewed, most of you are familiar with Tom Friedman, who wrote The World is Flat. And then he recently wrote a book, which I highly recommend, and it's called That Used to Be Us. And Wagner had interviewed him for his book, and Friedman said to Wagner, there's one thing I got wrong in The World is Flat. The pace of technology. It was faster than what I anticipated. The pace of change. As a teacher, I often say to the students, how many people 10 years ago do you know worked at Facebook? Didn't even exist at that point. The point that the types of jobs that many of the students today are going to be competing for, a lot of them don't even exist yet. Because of this flattening, because of this change in how the economy is working. So educators, parents, have to be very concerned about what can I do to prepare my child or my student. Because the old paradigm of education, which was driven by an industrial model, like an assembly line. Everybody has the same textbook. Here's this content. The textbook publishers, they figure out, well, there's 180 days in a year. This is what we can cover. Everybody should cover this. The people who create these standardized tests look at what the textbooks are covering. They align that with the standards. And at the end of the year, here's a test based on what we say you should learn. Versus really thinking in this much more global perspective of how to adapt to things that are changing at a very, very rapid rate. So he has in his list critical thinking and problem solving. And one of the key things relative to problem solving, he says, and I believe, is being able to identify what is the challenge, what is the problem. Being able to define the question that you're looking at. Now, in that little play scenario that we had before, I kind of gave you a challenge. Come up with pretty loose parameters, right? But that process, I hope, felt kind of like just free and it was playful. And what we don't do enough of in school is do serious play, where you really have to grapple with things, issues of much greater import than can you get, what was the one? Wine pong? Somebody should patent that, by the way. If you could just go to the next one. Collaboration across networks. Yeah, let's actually put them all up. Collaboration across networks and leading by influence. In your little groups, you collaborated. That term has been thrown around in education speak for quite a while. But it is absolutely clear from the research that students' ability to work in teams that meet both physically and virtually are going to be critical skills to be able to manage life in 2020, 2025. Most of you in this room probably collaborate with people who are far away from where you are physically, which kind of gets back to that high-tech high in the glass and this notion that the school needs to be permeable, because the notion of school as a place with these rigid walls and everything happens in my little classroom, then your little classroom, even the notion that school is just this physical space, these buildings, is seriously being challenged. When I can go and, right now, for free, attend a lecture at Harvard or MIT through some of these massive online courses. You may have heard the term MOOC, M-O-O-C. In higher education, that's one of the big issues that they're looking at, because the cost has become so prohibitive that why not have some of these large lecture classes be done virtually so that you can have more of these more seminars, Socratic kind of discussions where you can really get into kind of deeper discussions to problem solve, etc. So this collaboration becomes essential. And as a speaker at the summit said, sometimes it borders on chaos. And that's something that a lot of educators are not quite comfortable with, and certainly administrators often are not comfortable with. The assumption being if you walk into a classroom and everybody's quiet and they've got their book out that they're learning. But you've got to question, what is it that they're learning? And are there other ways in which they could learn using these resources that are expanding almost exponentially? And as the last speaker, I really love that notion of using gaming technology as another vehicle for engaging students. Agility and adaptability. If a student can't go into the workplace and change as projects change, as a technology-based changes, as new discoveries are made, they're going to have a lot of difficulty. And how do you become agile and adaptable if you can't deal with failure? If you're in a system that says failure is a negative thing. Initiative and entrepreneurism. If in the U.S. we have this educational crisis, and in large parts because students feel disconnected, or their incentive to do well is because, well, if I get this good grade, then I move forward and then I can get into a good college, as opposed to having an intrinsic desire to learn. And so in his book, Creating Innovators, he challenges us to figure out ways in which you can get students engaged and have initiative. This movie I mentioned before, 1098, is so fantastic in terms of seeing some of the great entrepreneurial ideas these students develop in school, where they're bringing in their science, they're bringing in their writing, they're developing self-confidence, and they're engaged. They have to get up in front of audiences, present their ideas. So they're finding this sense of initiative through entrepreneurship. Effective oral and written communication. How many of you are teachers in the classroom? Okay. How many of you feel that we have some room for improvement in terms of student writing? So creating these situations where students have to write but things about things that have some relevance to them could shift that equation. Accessing and analyzing information. We all know there's so much out there, and some of it is just, well, you know, if it was on the computer, it must be true, right? So being able to look at that information, what's valid, what's not, what's the basis for saying that it has some validity. And then the last thing he has is curiosity. So that's Wagner's take on the need for what he says, not educational reform, but reinventing education, is to really focus on these things. Could you go to the next one? How many in the room are familiar now with the Common Core State Standards and Next Generation Science Standards? Okay, so in the last few years in the U.S., there's been a push in K-12 education to promote Common Core State Standards in math and then in English language arts, which also includes history, social studies, and what they call technical studies. And then the sciences, just to be different, their movement is called the Next Generation Science Standards. What's very, very interesting and, from my perspective, encouraging is that they are both based on what they call these reasoning practices or ways of thinking or a certain mindset. And if you think about what design thinking is, it really is a mindset, an approach to being open-minded, to coming in and exploring an idea, and then understanding all the criteria, understanding what knowledge I need to bring to solve whatever problem that's in front of me. So these are the next generation science standards, the reasoning practices. Asking questions ties right back to what Wagner was talking about, being curious, being able to define the problem. Developing and using models. Now, part of that creates incredible opportunities for people who work with the sort of technology that Autodesk creates or other technology companies create, or games. A model could be a graph on a piece of paper. A model could be a physical model to represent some idea I have. A model could be some virtual representation. A model could be some video with interaction. A model can also be something in my head. But if you're going to collaborate with others, which seems to be, based on what economists are saying and what people in educational research are saying, is that there is going to need to be this collaboration. Well, how can I cross cultures? I can use a common language through models and be able to express ideas and interact with others through those. So I won't go through all of these in detail, but as we look at design thinking, I suggest that there's a great parallel and therefore some great opportunities for design to migrate into the regular core curriculum. Design has been, for quite a while, been embraced by those elective types of classes in K-12 education in the U.S., where there'll be an engineering design class that's an elective, or there'll be an industrial technology or a web design class. But that is such an infinitely small segment of the school population. I think the challenge is how can design and design thinking and the types of tools that designers use, how can those things become an integral part of the core academic curriculum in history, in social studies, in math? My God, think about a student struggling in an algebra class, what they could do with some of the technologies we have to help them better understand and to model and to visualize the types of things that they struggle with when they're just dealing with algorithms through a textbook. I'm going to show you a couple examples in a little bit to clarify that. And I need to know what time you have time. 1:45? Okay. So let's go. So this is the Common Core Standards for math, very similar in a lot of ways to the science, these reasoning practices, these ways of thinking. What this means, if we're successful as educators in K-12, we're not going to be assessing somebody because they can regurgitate some information, but rather, have they developed these thinking skills? Have they been able to ask the right questions, to find the right problem? Something that's been inherently an inherent part of design. For somebody who's comfortable with this notion of iteration, for trying one solution, and no, that didn't work, and I learned from that, and trying this next one. Again, this notion of failing up. Those are the sorts of things that in science, which for so long, and still is primarily, okay, memorize what's on the periodic table and tell me these groups, and, you know, and as soon as you finish that test, and I know I experienced it, because you weren't connecting it to things that were relevant for you. Let's go ahead. I'll skip this, but the English language arts, there's some great places here where students are going to be much more emphasis on non-fictional or what they call informational writing. So students can work on projects and then do writing around that so that design can become part of the integrated academic curriculum. So design thinking, This is from Edutopia's. This past summer, they had a design thinking kind of virtual camp or workshop. It was kind of concurrent with Google had a maker camp, which was really kind of interesting. I think you're going to see more and more of this. I just discovered this morning that this past year, Autodesk sponsored this other virtual camp called Panorama 360. Have any of you? I was like, wow, I wish I knew about this. But there's this real attempt to get kids to start really digging in and thinking. Oftentimes the topics are around issues about sustainability and this world that we're living in. So go ahead to the next one. So this is a summary. I would highly recommend going to Edutopia, and you'll see some of the results from this camp. But first and foremost, this comes from really the work of IDEO, which is the David Kelly and Tim Brown, who are kind of the instigators of this design thinking process. It is a mindset, okay? It's something you could use to develop a product. It's something that you could do for investigating a historical situation. It's something that you could do to help an organization be better able to serve its customers. It doesn't have to be the development of some physical thing. It's a process that can be applied to many different areas. So let's go through those. It's human-centered. One of the biggest things about design thinking is the word empathy. Getting to understand who it is that you're designing for. What are their needs? What are their desires? This company, IDEO, spends a lot of time doing what's called ethnographic studies. They'll sit and they'll observe people. Let's say you're trying to design a better way for people to check out at the supermarket. Well, they'll have people just watching and what's going on and how do people react, and when they're trying to hold their bag up and trying to, I don't know if any of you have done that, self-serve checkout. It can get pretty daunting sometimes. But you need to develop empathy. If you're an educator, you need to understand who those students are, where they're coming from, what are their interests. Let's go ahead. It's collaborative. Do you see some themes happening between the Common Core standards and what Tony Wagner was saying, what ID is saying? Next one. It's experimental. Well, what's the nature of experiment? It's trial and error. It's failing and going, yay, I failed. Now I understand that that didn't work, and I'm not going to repeat it. And if you're working alongside somebody, the potential of figuring out what went wrong is even enhanced. And it's something you remember. Any of you failed in this room at anything? Okay? Do you remember it? There's something, in the actual neuroscience, there's actual brain chemistry. There's this chemical reward when you figure something out, right? You feel kind of good. There's also the brain chemistry when you fail and then you've overcome that failure. That embeds it into your brain, makes those connections in a way that's very different than I read it in the book and I'm going to give it back to you. Thank you, I took the test. Now I can go on to calculus because I just finished trig. Let's go to the next one. And it's optimistic. So that's what IDEO is saying about it. If we could go to the next one. This is just a little bit of the summer camp. So these are some of the things that they use to flesh that out, that there needs to be this discovery. Autodesk in the Digital STEAM Workshop, if you haven't looked at that, I might suggest, because it's built on this design thinking. We have similar steps. Start out with understanding, discovering, understanding the problem, asking the right questions, understanding the user. They talk about interpretation. In research, they'll talk about analyzing the data. Okay, I interviewed 20 people. What did it mean? What were they saying? Or I looked at 20 competitive products if I'm designing some physical thing. Or I looked at how somebody, their motion when they're interacting with something. What does that tell me? So I need to be able to develop that analysis skills. Ideation, innovation. Think of the tools we now have in terms of being able to take what's up here and communicate it to ourselves and to others. I thought it was a great slide in the morning when the little boy had that piece that he made on a 3D printer. I don't know if you saw that. He had something in his head that unless you took an x-ray, it would have been hard to see it. And he didn't need to have all these incredible skills of model making and sketching. He was able to present it. Experimentation. And then evolution. So taking what I learned, building upon that, building upon the work of others. And that's from Edutopia. Not to be outdone, so IDEO, which is probably the biggest design firm, so they say, and other people say, I don't know if you're familiar with a company called Frog Design, which is also, they'll probably tell you they're the biggest. So they now have set up another nonprofit that's focused on design thinking. They're basically saying the same thing with some different words and a different... But imagine, seek to get understanding, build, learn from your mistakes, and then make something that's real. And they have a big focus. If you go to their website, they had this nonprofit, and it's called, actually maybe in the next slide. Yeah, Collective Action. And they developed this whole toolkit, which actually graphically is really kind of neat, very simplistic graphics. But they're actually working in developing countries using this toolkit, helping people to look at problems like sanitation, water, and how to come up with solutions collectively, and experimenting, trying different things. And some fascinating examples in there. This is one where they're working, I think this is in Afghanistan, of empowering young women and how they can improve their own education. Let's go to the next one. So this is what I mentioned before, the Digital STEAM Workshop, which is based on, the curriculum is based on design thinking. We go to the next one. So I want to show you, and I'm going to apologize in advance, I took a couple of clips of video, and I hope it's going to work out okay. But basically, this is a project. It's students are asked in this Digital STEAM Workshop, and they're given technical videos in terms of how to use the software. They're developing a 30-second public service announcement. And this one topic for this public service announcement is the depletion of fish in the ocean. So if we can hopefully go to the next slide and the video will play. Oh, no. Video's not there? Well, you wanted to see that next slide anyway, right? No video? No video. Why don't we go back to that? Okay. I apologize. If you go online to Digital STEAM Workshop, you'll actually see a whole series of videos that take you through. But I think it's a fascinating project in that students in a history, a social studies class, could take a concept like depletion of fish, and they use the software using very primitive geometry, so it was pretty fast to do, to represent by color, shape, and size different types of fish. And then they had an animated time frame going 100,000 years, 10,000 years, 1,000 years. And you could see very quickly the data that they looked up on Wikipedia and other places in terms of, different species of fish and what happened. So it was an interesting use of technology to kind of think through, in this case, a social issue. So if we go to the next one, yes, I'm beating up my son and my cat. So that's my son and that's myself. This is a project that we're working on to try and use. We're actually using Catch 123D design. You may have seen 123D, the beta. It's a free online. It's now, they've made it official. It's 123D design. So we took this picture, my daughter took this picture, because we're working with an English teacher. English teacher has this is for, I think, 8th grade students in English. They're reading a novel called The Woods Runner, and it's set in the Revolutionary War. She has, over the years, used the same novel and have asked kids to write out what they imagine a continuation of the story. Essentially, this boy winds up in Philadelphia. It's the Revolutionary War, and the book kind of ends there. So what the English teacher was excited about doing is, well, how could I use technology to engage the kids to tell the story in other ways beyond just writing it out? She certainly is going to have them write it out. So if you go to the next slide, that's what I look like as a revolutionary soldier. So taking the photo, bringing it into Sketchbook Pro, which is a free application, tracing it, very quickly coloring it. This is one panel of what will be a comic strip using Pixlr, which is another program Autodesk has available. Then kids will be able to put in their conversations and tell their story through a comic book. Then they can also do some writing. So if you kind of go back 45 minutes from when we started and talked about this notion of, well, what kinds of things that can you to engage kids through the sorts of things that designers, this is nothing new for designers, right, of creating visuals. But how many kids have those skills? How many teachers have the skills? And most importantly, how many teachers have the time to have kids take on a project of that nature? So technology shortens that process. I'll finish up. We do have this video, hopefully. Oh, this is the video of the fish. Okay, we'll just... just run it. It's just like 20 seconds. So there's the content knowledge that was derived about these fish, the depletion of fish, and then here's real quick, I sped it up. And then the final thing should show up in a second. But when you talk about models, not just this virtual model of the finished thing, but all of this, that graph is a model that a math teacher could use to really get into understanding data. And then in the final presentation, kids have to develop effective skills in oral, visual communication, and writing communication. So imagine a student being able to present this to the class along with, a written document. But it doesn't take the kind of time and skill that in a autoditional class setting it would take. So this last one that we'll show, Autodesk 1, 2, 3 catch. Okay, so imagine you have a student, and with 1, 2, 3 catch you can basically scan a person. How many of you are familiar with catch? Okay, so capture a student, and let's go to she's going to do a history project. So her history project, they're studying the Vikings. She's going to investigate navigation on the sea, boat building. So the student now has a 3D avatar of themselves, done in, if you've done catch, you could do it very quickly. Now, depending on the age level, I know for a fact, having themselves in there makes a huge difference. I am there. I'm going to take you to Norway. And in this case, another student could say, I'm going to go to China, look at navigation there, learning about a culture. And I think as I was talking, we saw a little bit of 1, 2, 3 design, where a student could design, you say, okay, you're going to study boats, create a Viking ship. Come up with your own masthead. The part, what do they call it? What was that called? The front figurehead. You could use sculpt and make kind of an interesting figurehead and kind of justify why it is that this would be used based on the culture that you studied. Now, if you were to do something like that in a traditional classroom, and I don't mean traditional in the sense of how they approached learning, but just traditional in terms of your time constraints. A teacher might think it'd be great to have kids build Viking boats. We would take tremendous amount of skill, tremendous amount of time. But here we have technology that minimizes that time significantly, minimizes that skill significantly. So I know it's time to wrap up. So design thinking, a mindset. If you can take that away, take some of the resources I mentioned, Edutopia, with their design thinking camp. 2 fantastic TED presentations are Tim Brown, from IDEO. He talks a lot about play. and then Tony Wagner, also on TED. If you look closely at the Common Core state standards, next generation science standards, I think you can start to see some connections so that when you go back into your educational institutions and the notion is still, well, design is that elective class over here, but we've got to focus on math, we've got to focus on science. I want you to think about what might happen if a kid were able to go on a virtual tour with the Vikings and figure out the navigation route. How much algebra would there be? How much trigonometry would there be? And how much potential student engagement could there be versus reading about it in a book and telling the teacher what you read in order to get a good grade, because that's what we typically do. So with that, I thank you very much. If there are any questions or comments, anybody want to patent their game? All right, thank you very much.